Jataka Tales, The Past Lives of Buddha Part 3. These ancient tales still explain modern life. Vatamiga Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a king. Within the grounds of his royal park, a wild antelope had begun to appear from time to time, moving gracefully through the gardens before disappearing again into the surrounding wilderness. Fascinated by the animal, the Bodhisattva ordered his gardener to capture it alive. The gardener understood that force would not work against such a cautious creature, so he chose a slower method. First, he spread honey over patches of fresh grass in places where the antelope often wandered. When the animal discovered the sweet taste, it quickly became attached to it and began returning to the same spots every day. After some time, the gardener began standing nearby while the antelope fed. At first, the creature remained fearful and would not approach while a human was present. But little by little, as the days passed and no harm came to it, the antelope's fear began to fade. Gradually, it allowed the gardener to stand closer, then closer still. Eventually, it became so comfortable that it would eat the honeyed grass directly from his hand. Once the gardener saw that the animal fully trusted him, he prepared the final step of his plan. He filled a gourd with honey and hung it over his shoulder. He tucked fresh grass into his waistcloth and began walking slowly away from the antelope, dropping pieces of sweetened grass along the path behind him. Completely distracted by its desire for the treats, the antelope followed him without hesitation, paying attention only to the next mouthful waiting ahead. Step by step, the gardener led the animal out of the parklands, through the palace grounds, and directly into the royal hall itself. The antelope, absorbed entirely in its craving, did not realize where it had gone until the gardener suddenly slammed the doors shut behind it. Immediately, the trapped creature panicked. Terrified, it ran wildly through the entrance hall, trembling and crashing against the walls in desperation. Hearing the commotion, the Bodhisattva came down to see what had happened. Looking upon the frightened animal, he reflected deeply on the cause of its suffering and said to those around him that there was nothing more degrading or dangerous in the world than slavery to the pleasures of taste and craving. Filled with compassion for the terrified antelope, the Bodhisattva ordered that it be released and allowed to return freely to the forest. In the lifetime of the Buddha, there was a man who had entered the Buddha's order despite the objections of his wealthy parents. Once ordained, he became an exceptionally dedicated disciple and an example to many others. However, his parents were heartbroken over the loss of their only son and secretly began planning a way to bring him back to worldly life. Together with one of their female slaves, they devised a strategy. They established a house along the route where the disciple walked each morning on his arms round. Every day, the slave offered him foods and drinks that he had loved before becoming a monk, slowly rekindling his attachment to comfort and pleasure. Over time, she encouraged him to sit inside the house while waiting for his meals, and little by little, his discipline weakened. Then one morning, the slave pretended to be ill and did not come out to greet him. Concerned, the disciple entered the inner rooms of the house to check on her, breaking the boundaries expected of monastic conduct. At that moment, the woman revealed the entire plan and persuaded him to abandon the religious life and return home. The wild antelope and the gardener from the earlier story were the previous lives of this disciple and the slave woman. The Buddha told this story to his disciples to show that this was not the first time attachment and craving had caused this man to fall under her influence and lose his freedom. Karadia Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as the leader of a herd of deer living deep within the forest. Wise and experienced, he understood the many dangers that threatened animals living near humans, especially the traps and snares set by hunters. Because of this knowledge, the other deer respected him and trusted his judgment. One day, the Bodhisattva's sister came to him with a request concerning her young son. She asked him to teach the young deer the skills necessary to survive in the forest, especially the tricks and instincts needed to avoid hunters and escape from traps. The Bodhisattva agreed and arranged a time to begin the lessons. However, when the day came, the young deer never appeared. Distracted and careless, he ignored the appointment and chose instead to wander through the forest on his own. The Bodhisattva waited, but his nephew did not come. No lessons were given, and no warnings were learned. Not long afterward, While roaming freely through the woods without caution or understanding, the young deer became trapped in a hunter's snare. Unable to free himself and lacking the knowledge that might have saved him, he was eventually found by the hunter and killed. The man carried the deer's flesh home to use as food. When the young deer's mother learned what had happened, she was overcome with grief and went to the Bodhisattva. She asked him why her son had never learned how to protect himself from danger. The Bodhisattva answered her honestly. He explained that the young deer had ignored the opportunity to learn and had refused the guidance offered to him. Because of his own disobedience and lack of discipline, he had fallen into danger unprepared. The Bodhisattva did not speak with cruelty, but neither did he pretend that the outcome had been undeserved. He told his sister not to lose herself in mourning, because her son's fate had come from his own refusal to listen and learn. In the lifetime of the Buddha, the young deer was reborn as a stubborn disciple who repeatedly ignored the advice and instruction of his senior monks. No matter how often he was corrected, he refused to listen or change his behavior. When the Buddha became aware of this, he told him this story to show that this same attitude had already led to destruction in a previous life. The young deer's mother, in that later lifetime, was reborn as a Palavana, one of the Buddha's foremost female disciples. 16. Tipalathamiga Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as the wise leader of a herd of deer living within a great forest. Because of his experience, he understood the dangers posed by hunters and knew many clever ways to avoid traps and survive in the wilderness. One day, his sister came to him with concern for her young son and asked the Bodhisattva to teach him the skills necessary to stay safe. The Bodhisattva agreed and arranged a time for the lessons. Unlike others who ignored guidance, the young deer arrived exactly when he was supposed to and listened carefully to every instruction. He studied attentively, practiced seriously, and took the teachings to heart. The Bodhisattva recognized his discipline and understood that the young deer had truly learned. Not long afterward, while wandering through the forest, the young deer was caught in a hunter's snare. Word quickly spread among the herd, and when his mother heard what had happened, she became overwhelmed with fear and grief. Certain that her son was doomed, she went anxiously to the Bodhisattva. However, he remained calm and reassured her. He told her not to worry because her son had paid close attention to his lessons and would know what to do. Caught in the trap, the young deer remembered everything he had been taught. Instead of panicking or struggling, he carefully lowered himself onto the ground and stretched out his legs as though life had already left his body. He let his tongue hang from his mouth, rolled his eyes upward, and breathed so softly through his nostrils that it was almost impossible to notice. His performance was so convincing that flies gathered around him and crows perched nearby, believing they had found a carcass beginning to decay. When the hunter eventually arrived, he examined the deer and assumed it had already died naturally and begun to rot. Not wanting to carry spoiled meat immediately, he released the snare and went off to gather wood so he could smoke the flesh before taking it home. The moment the hunter disappeared into the forest, the young deer sprang to his feet and ran swiftly away, escaping back to safety and returning unharmed to his mother. In the lifetime of the Buddha, the young deer was reborn as Rahula, the Buddha's son. Despite his noble lineage, Rahula never demanded special treatment and was deeply committed to discipline and proper conduct. At one point, after listening to the Buddha's teachings, many monks and novices would simply fall asleep inside the sermon hall instead of returning to their quarters. The Buddha disapproved of this behavior and established a rule forbidding novices from sleeping in the same room as fully ordained monks. The following night, the monks, afraid of violating the new rule, did not prepare a sleeping place for Rahula as they usually had. Rather than complain or seek exceptions because he was the Buddha's son, Rahula quietly left to find another place to sleep. So committed was he to following the rules exactly that he chose to sleep in the Buddha's outhouse rather than risk accidentally breaking the discipline if a monk entered during the night. When the Buddha later learned what Rahula had done, he was moved by his sincerity and dedication. As a result, he adjusted the rule, allowing novices to stay in a monk's quarters for up to 2 days when necessary. Later, when some of the disciples were discussing Rahula's remarkable discipline and humility, The Buddha told them this story to show that Rahula had possessed the same careful obedience and dedication to instruction in previous lives as well. The young Dee's mother, in that later life, was reborn as Upalavana, one of the Buddha's foremost female disciples. Maluta Jataka, in a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as an ascetic who lived in solitude at the foot of a mountain deep within the wilderness. Far from villages and human activity, he devoted his life to contemplation and inner peace. Not far from his dwelling, in a cave hidden among the rocks, lived two close companions, a lion and a tiger. Though different in nature, they shared the same territory and had long lived together without conflict. One day, however, a disagreement arose between them. As cold winds swept through the mountain region, the two animals began arguing about the true cause of the coldest time of the month. The tiger insisted that the dark half of the lunar cycle, when the moon gradually disappeared from the sky, was the coldest period. The lion strongly disagreed, claiming that the cold was worse during the bright half of the month, when the moon was growing fuller and the nights were illuminated. Neither was willing to abandon his opinion, and their argument grew more heated as each tried to convince the other. Eventually, realizing they could not settle the matter themselves, they decided to seek the judgment of the Bodhisattva, whose wisdom was respected by all who knew him. The lion and tiger approached the ascetic and explained their dispute, each confidently presenting his own view. The Bodhisattva listened calmly to both sides without interruption. After hearing them fully, he explained that neither darkness nor moonlight was truly responsible for the cold. The real cause, he said, was the wind. Sometimes the wind was stronger during the dark half of the month, and at other times during the bright half. Because of this, both of them had experienced cold during different periods and believed their own observations to be universally true. Hearing this explanation, the lion and tiger realized that neither of them had been entirely wrong. Their conflict dissolved immediately, and the two friends made peace with one another. In the lifetime of the Buddha, the lion and tiger were reborn as two forest-dwelling disciples known as Elder Junior, whose name meant light, and Elder Kala, whose name meant dark. Just like in their former lives, they developed the same disagreement about which part of the lunar cycle brought the coldest weather. Unable to settle the argument, they eventually brought the question before the Buddha. After listening to them, the Buddha explained that he had already resolved this very same dispute for them long ago, and he then told them this story from their past lives. Matakabata Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a tree spirit who lived near the home of a well-known Brahmin priest. The priest regularly performed religious ceremonies and rituals for the local people, including the traditional feast for the dead, during which animals were sacrificed as offerings for departed relatives. On one such occasion, the priest selected a goat to be killed for the ritual. Following custom, he instructed his students to take the animal down to the river before the ceremony. There, they washed and groomed the goat carefully, fed him well, and prepared him for what would be his final meal before death. As the goat stewed by the river, something extraordinary happened. Nearing the end of his life, he suddenly became aware of his past existences and the karmic chain that had brought him to this moment. Realizing what this death truly meant, he burst into loud laughter filled with relief and joy. But almost immediately afterward, his laughter turned into sorrow, and he began to cry. The students were confused and disturbed by the strange behavior. They asked the goat why he had first laughed and then wept. The goat replied that he would explain everything only in the presence of their master, the Brahmin priest. Curious and unsettled, the students brought the goat back and presented him before the priest. There, the goat revealed the truth. He explained that in one of his previous lives, he himself had once been a Brahmin priest who had sacrificed a goat during a feast for the dead, believing it to be a righteous religious act. However, because of the suffering and death he had caused, he had accumulated terrible karma. As a result, for 500 successive lifetimes, he had been repeatedly reborn only to die by beheading. The goat explained that this present life will be the final one in that long cycle of suffering. That was why he had laughed, because his approaching death meant the end of centuries of misery. But he had cried out of compassion for the Brahmin priest standing before him, because he now understood that the priest was creating the same karmic destiny for himself by preparing to kill another living being. Hearing this, the priest was horrified. Deeply shaken by the goat's story, he immediately decided that he would not carry out the sacrifice. He declared that he would personally protect the goat and ensure that no harm came to him. But the goat calmly replied that no one could escape the consequences of karma once the conditions had already matured. Fate, he said, could not be avoided. Not long after the goat was released, a violent storm suddenly formed overhead. A bolt of lightning struck a nearby rock with tremendous force, shattering it apart. One sharp fragment flew through the air and instantly severed the goat's head, fulfilling the karma that could not be escaped. The Bodhisattva, who had witnessed everything from within his tree, saw the profound lesson contained in these events. He then manifested himself in the sky, seated cross-legged in midair before the growing crowd that had gathered around the scene. From above, he spoke about the consequences of violence and the terrible results that arise from taking life, even when done in the name of tradition or religion. His words filled the people with deep fear of the suffering caused by harmful actions, and many who heard him abandoned killing from that day forward and committed themselves to living more righteous lives. In the lifetime of the Buddha, some local people had begun killing goats, sheep, and other animals during feasts for the dead, believing that such sacrifices would benefit their departed relatives. Seeing this, some of the Buddha's disciples asked whether any good could truly come from acts of killing performed with supposedly noble intentions. The Buddha replied that no genuine good can ever arise from taking life, regardless of the purpose behind it. To illustrate this truth, he told them this story from one of his past lives. In this case, the Buddha did not identify any previous births other than his own. Ayasatabata Jataka, in a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a tree spirit who lived within a great banyan tree standing at the entrance of a village. The tree was old and widely respected by the local people, many of whom believed the spirit dwelling there could influence fortune and success. One day, a man preparing to leave on an important venture came before the banyan tree and made a promise. He vowed that if his journey proved successful and brought him profit, he would return and make an offering in honor of the spirit living there. Time passed, and the man's venture succeeded exactly as he had hoped. He returned safely, having gained wealth and good fortune from his undertaking. Wanting to fulfill his vow, he gathered several animals to sacrifice as an offering beneath the banyan tree. As preparations for the sacrifice began, the Bodhisattva appeared before the man. Speaking with compassion and wisdom, he questioned the meaning of such an act. He explained that taking life in order to honor a promise or seek blessings was not a virtuous deed but a harmful one. No true good, he said, could arise from causing suffering and death to living beings. Instead of creating merit, such actions only planted the seeds for future karmic suffering. The man listened carefully to the Bodhisattva's words and realized the mistake he was about to make. Deeply moved by the teaching, he abandoned the sacrifice entirely. News of the event spread throughout the village, and the people, hearing the Bodhisattva's lesson, gradually stopped performing animal sacrifices as offerings. In the lifetime of the Buddha, it was common for merchants and travelers to sacrifice animals before beginning dangerous journeys, believing this would bring them protection and success. If they returned safely and with profit, they would often perform another sacrifice in gratitude. Some of the Buddha's disciples asked whether any true benefit could come from such practices. In response, the Buddha explained that no real good can arise from acts rooted in killing and harm, even when performed with hopeful or religious intentions. To illustrate this truth, he told them this story from one of his previous lives. In this case, the Buddha did not identify any earlier births other than his own. Nalapana Jataka, in a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as the king of a vast troop of monkeys numbering 80,000. Wise and cautious, he cared deeply for the safety of those under his leadership. Because the forest was filled with hidden dangers, he had established an important rule for his troop. Whenever they discovered unfamiliar fruit or an unknown water source, they were not to eat or drink from it until he had inspected it himself. One day, while wandering through the forest in search of food, some of the monkeys came across a beautiful lake they had never seen before. The water looked fresh and inviting, but remembering the Bodhisattva's instructions, they resisted the temptation to drink. Instead, They sat patiently at the shore and waited for their king to arrive. When the Bodhisattva reached the lake, he carefully examined the area before approaching the water. Looking closely at the muddy shore, he noticed something unusual. There were many footprints leading down into the lake, but none coming back out. From this single detail, he immediately understood the truth. An ogre was living within the water, devouring any creature that entered. Watching from beneath the surface, the ogre quickly realized that the monkeys were hesitating. Frustrated that his prey would not come near the water, he emerged and tried to deceive them. Pretending friendliness, he encouraged the monkeys to enter the lake and drink freely, hoping to lure them within reach. The Bodhisattva, however, was far too wise to fall for the trick. Instead of risking the lives of his troop, he devised another solution. He picked up a reed growing near the edge of the lake and blew through it, causing it to become magically hollow from end to end. Then, using his power, he commanded that all the reeds surrounding the lake become hollow in the same way. From that day onward, the reeds there remained empty inside. The monkeys each took one of the hollow reeds, sat safely around the edge of the lake, and drank the water through them without ever stepping into the dangerous water itself. In this way, all 80,000 monkeys were able to satisfy their thirst while remaining completely safe from the ogre. In the lifetime of the Buddha, while traveling on pilgrimage, some of the Buddha's disciples sent the novices into the forest to gather reeds that could be used as cases for storing sewing needles. However, when the novices returned, they were surprised to find that every reed they had collected was completely hollow, with no inner divisions or nodes inside them. Curious about this unusual feature, they asked the Buddha how such reeds had come to exist. In response, the Buddha told them this story from one of his past lives to explain the origin of the hollow reeds. The ogre from the story was reborn in that later life as Devadatta, who would eventually become the Buddha's rival. The 80,000 monkeys were the earlier births of the Buddha's disciples. Kurunga Jataka, in a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a clever antelope who lived deep within the forest. He loved feeding on fallen fruit beneath the great trees, but he also understood the dangers hidden within the wilderness. Because of this, he was always cautious whenever approaching unfamiliar places. At that time, a skilled hunter had developed a method for trapping animals that came to feed on fruit. He would search the forest floor for footprints beneath fruit trees, and whenever he discovered signs of regular animal activity, he would climb into the branches and build a hidden platform where he could wait in silence. Concealed among the leaves, he would remain motionless for hours until an unsuspecting animal wandered beneath the tree. Then, from above, he would strike with his spear. The Bodhisattva had learned to recognize this danger and never approached fruit trees carelessly. One day, while wandering through the forest, he came upon a tree heavy with ripe fruit. Unknown to him, the hunter was already hidden above, waiting patiently for prey. Rather than immediately stepping beneath the tree, the Bodhisattva stopped at a safe distance and carefully observed the surroundings. The hunter, growing impatient as the antelope refused to approach, decided to lure him closer. From his hidden perch, he tossed several pieces of fruit down onto the ground directly in front of the Bodhisattva. At once, the antelope became suspicious. Fruit should fall naturally from above, not land in deliberate places far from the tree. Remaining calm, he slowly scanned the branches until he finally spotted the hidden hunter concealed among the leaves. However, instead of reacting with fear, the Bodhisattva pretended not to notice him. Addressing the tree aloud as though speaking casually, he remarked that its behavior seemed very strange. Normally, he said, fruit falls straight down from the branches, but this tree appeared to throw its fruit outward toward him. Since such behavior was unusual, he concluded that it would be wiser to eat from another tree instead. The hunter immediately realized he had been discovered. Frustrated and angry, he hurled his spear at the fleeing antelope, but the weapon missed its target completely, and the Bodhisattva escaped unharmed. Now safely out of danger, the Bodhisattva turned back and spoke directly to the hunter. He told him that although he had failed to strike his prey today, he would not escape the consequences of his harmful actions. Even if the spear had missed its mark, the results of cruelty and violence would eventually find their way back to him. In the lifetime of the Buddha, The hunter was reborn as Devadatta, the disciple who later became the Buddha's rival and repeatedly attempted to kill him. One day, when the Buddha heard his disciples discussing Devadatta's attempts on his life, he told them this story to show that Devadatta had also tried and failed to kill him in previous lives. Kukura Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a wise dog who led a large pack living near a cemetery outside a great city. Though they lived humbly, the Bodhisattva guided the other dogs with intelligence and compassion, and they trusted him completely. One evening, after spending the day enjoying himself in the royal park, the king returned to the palace after nightfall. Because it was already late, his servants neglected their usual duties and left the king's luxurious chariot standing outside without properly removing its harness and decorations. During the night, the king's own palace dogs wandered over to the unattended chariot and began chewing on the fine leather straps and ornaments. The next morning, when the damage was discovered, the king became furious. Convinced that his noble purebred dogs would never behave in such a disgraceful way, he immediately assumed that stray dog from the city must have entered the palace through the sewers during the night and destroyed the leatherwork. Blinded by anger, he gave a harsh command. Every dog in the city was to be killed except for the royal dogs living inside the palace. As soldiers and servants began carrying out the order, panic spread among the city's dogs. Many escaped and fled to the cemetery, where they sought refuge with the Bodhisattva. Trembling with fear, they explained what was happening and begged for help. After hearing the story, the Bodhisattva carefully considered the situation. He quickly realized that ordinary city dogs could never have entered the heavily guarded palace grounds so easily. The only dogs capable of causing the damage were the king's own animals. Understanding that innocent creatures were being punished for a crime they did not commit, the Bodhisattva promised the frightened dogs that he would save them. Determined to stop the slaughter, he made his way toward the palace. By filling his mind with thoughts of compassion, loving kindness, and the 10 perfect virtues, he moved through the city calmly and fearlessly. His peaceful presence was so powerful that no one stopped him as he entered the royal palace itself. When the Bodhisattva stood before the king, the two began to speak about the situation. The Bodhisattva respectfully explained that the king's judgment was flawed. By sparing some dogs while condemning others without knowing who was truly guilty, the king was acting according to the 4 corrupt paths of judgment: partiality, hatred, ignorance, and fear. Such behavior, he explained, was unworthy of a ruler whose duty was to govern with justice and wisdom. The king, recognizing the extraordinary intelligence and calmness of the dog before him, became curious and asked whether the Bodhisattva knew who had truly damaged the chariot harness. The Bodhisattva answered directly, telling the king that the guilty dogs were his own royal purebreds. The king demanded proof. In response, the Bodhisattva instructed him to prepare a mixture of crushed grass and buttermilk and feed it to the palace dogs. The king followed the instructions, and before long the dogs vomited. Mixed within the vomit were unmistakable pieces of the chewed leather harness. Seeing the truth revealed so clearly, the king was astonished. Deeply impressed by the Bodhisattva's wisdom and fairness, he offered to make him ruler of the kingdom. But the Bodhisattva had no desire for power. Instead, he asked only that the king listen carefully to a teaching on righteousness, compassion, and justice. The king listened attentively as the Bodhisattva spoke about the value of protecting life and ruling without cruelty. By the end of the discourse, the king was profoundly moved. He abandoned his violent order and declared that no living creature within his kingdom should ever again be killed unjustly. He also decreed that from that day forward, all dogs, not only the royal ones, will be fed the same fine food prepared for the palace itself. In the lifetime of the Buddha, King Pasenadi was known as a righteous ruler and a devoted supporter of the Buddha and his disciples. He regularly provided food and offerings for the monastic community. However, despite his generosity, the monks rarely stayed to eat at the palace itself because the people serving there were cold and unfriendly. Instead, the disciples preferred to take their meals at the homes of kind-hearted friends and supporters. When King Pasenadi learned this, he wanted to strengthen his relationship with the Buddha and the Sakya clan from which the Buddha came. Hoping to create a closer connection, he requested to marry a woman from the Sakya family. But the Sakyas were proud and deeply protective of their bloodline. They considered themselves superior and did not want to give one of their noble daughters to the king. At the same time, refusing a ruler directly could lead to dangerous consequences. So they devised a deception. They selected the daughter of a Sakya nobleman who had been born from a slave woman and presented her to the king as if she were fully noble-born. Because King Pasenadi's attendants were suspicious of the Sakya clan's arrogance, they wanted proof of her status before bringing her back to the palace. To deceive them, the family staged a meal together. At the beginning of the meal, a servant delivered what was supposedly an extremely important letter to the father. After taking only a single bite of food, he spent the rest of the meal reading the document instead of eating. This created the illusion that he had dined alongside his daughter while technically avoiding fully sharing a meal with someone born from a slave. Unaware of the deception, King Pasenadi genuinely loved his new queen and elevated her to the position of chief consort. In time, she gave birth to a son who was raised with every privilege expected of a prince. Yet as the boy grew older, he noticed something strange. Unlike other royal children, he never received gifts or recognition from his mother's family. Wanting to protect him from the truth, his mother lied and told him that her relatives lived very far away and therefore rarely sent anything. Eventually, once he became older, the prince decided to visit his mother's family himself. Despite her attempts to stop him, he insisted on going. When the Sakya clan learned of his arrival, they panicked. Unwilling to show respect to someone they considered beneath them, they sent all their noble children who were younger than the prince away to the countryside so none would have to bow before him. A few days later, as the prince prepared to leave, one of his soldiers overheard a Sakya servant revealing the truth. The prince's mother had been born from a slave woman. Realizing how deeply both he and his mother had been insulted and deceived, the prince became consumed by anger and swore that one day, when he held power, he would take revenge against the Sakya clan. When King Pasenadi later discovered the truth about his queen's origins, he too became furious. Feeling humiliated, he stripped his wife and son of their royal privileges and reduced their status to little more than that of servants. But shortly afterward, the Budao intervened. While acknowledging that the Sakya clan had behaved wrongly, he explained to the king that the queen and her son were still descended from royal men, and that the circumstances of the mother's birth did not diminish their worth. Hearing this, King Pasenadi reconsidered his actions and restored their honor and status. Around this same period, the wife of King Pasenadi's commander-in-chief had failed to bear him a son, and because of this, he sent her away to return to her family. Before leaving, the woman went to pay respect to the Buddha. When she arrived, the Buddha advised her not to depart. Filled with hope by his words, she returned home and told her husband what had happened. Trusting that the Buddha must have spoken for a reason, the commander-in-chief allowed her to stay. Not long afterward, the woman became pregnant. During her pregnancy, she developed a strong desire to bathe in and drink the sacred ceremonial water used by the royal families of another clan. Wanting to fulfill her wish, the commander-in-chief drove her there himself in his chariot. When they arrived, he fought his way past the guards and broke through the iron barrier protecting the sacred well so that his wife could bathe in the holy water. The rulers of that region were enraged by this violation. Ignoring the warnings of their spiritual advisor, who predicted disaster if they pursued him, 500 kings mounted their chariots and chased after the commander-in-chief. Calm and fearless, he waited until all 500 chariots had aligned perfectly. Then, using a mighty bow said to be 1,000 times stronger than an ordinary one, he fired a single arrow. The arrow pierced through every king at exactly the point where their belts were fastened. None of the kings realized they had been mortally wounded and continued the pursuit. Finally, the commander-in-chief stopped and shouted back that they were already dead. Believing him mad, they mocked him. He then instructed them to loosen one king's belt. The moment they did, the king collapsed lifeless to the ground. Understanding what had happened, the commander-in-chief advised the others to return home, settle their affairs, and prepare themselves before removing their armor. One by one, they did exactly that, dying when they were ready. In time, the commander-in-chief's wife gave birth not to one son, but to twin boys. Astonishingly, over the years she gave birth to twins 16 times, producing 32 sons in total. Every one of them grew into a strong, heroic, and exceptionally gifted man. One day, some citizens who had lost a legal case approached the commander-in-chief, claiming the judges had been corrupted by bribes. He investigated the matter personally and discovered that the accusations were true. Acting fairly, he retried the case himself and ruled in favor of the wronged men. The people of the city praised his sense of justice, and when King Pasenadi heard of it, he placed the commander-in-chief in charge of the courts. But the corrupt judges, now unable to enrich themselves through bribery, became resentful. Seeking revenge, they told the king that the commander-in-chief was secretly plotting to overthrow him. King Pasenadi foolishly believed the lie and decided the man had to die. He secretly arranged for criminals to raid towns near the border and ordered the commander-in-chief and all 32 of his sons to deal with the threat. At the same time, he instructed soldiers to execute them while they were away. The order was carried out, and the commander-in-chief and all his sons were beheaded. When the commander-in-chief's wife learned of the massacre, she gathered her 32 daughters-in-law together. Though consumed by grief, she urged them not to fall into hatred or vengeance. She explained that although their husbands had been innocent in this life, such suffering must have arisen from karma created in previous existences. Seeking revenge, she warned them, would only create even worse suffering in the future. Spies reported her words back to King Pasenadi. Hearing of her wisdom and restraint, the king was overwhelmed with remorse for what he had done. He went to seek counsel from the Buddha, but while he was away from the palace, his newly appointed commander-in-chief, furious over the assassination of his predecessor, launched a coup and placed the half-slave prince upon the throne. Determined to reclaim his kingdom, King Pasenadi hurried back toward the capital, hoping to gather support. But he arrived after the city gates had already been closed for the night. Exhausted from traveling quickly under the harsh sun and wind, he was forced to spend the night in a simple roadside shelter. Weak and worn down, he died there before morning. The new king, now finally in power, had never forgotten the humiliation inflicted upon him and his mother by the Sakya clan. At last, he saw his opportunity for revenge. He gathered a great army and marched toward the Sakya territory. The Buddha, perceiving what was happening, wished to protect his people. He traveled to the border and sat beneath a small tree that provided barely any shade. When the king arrived and saw him there, he asked why the Buddha chose to sit under such a poor tree when a great banyan nearby offered far better shelter. The Buddha calmly replied that the shade of his own family was enough to keep him cool. The king understood the meaning immediately. Realizing the Buddha was silently standing in protection of the Sakya clan, he turned his army around and withdrew. Twice more he attempted to march against them, and each time the Buddha appeared beneath the same tree, causing the king to abandon the invasion. After stopping the king for the third time, some of the Buddha's disciples praised him for protecting his family. The Buddha then told them this story, explaining that this was not the first time he had acted for the welfare of his relatives. However, when the king prepared for a fourth invasion, the Buddha chose not to intervene. He understood that the karma of the Sakya clan had fully ripened and that their past actions would now bear fruit. Without the Buddha standing in his way, the king's army entered the territory and slaughtered everyone they encountered, beginning even with infants, before returning victorious to the capital. The king in this story was an earlier birth of Ananda, one of the Buddha's closest disciples, and the dogs of the city were earlier births of the Buddha's followers.